It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. We're at week number 4 of my little remakes month here, and this one's going to be kind of interesting. This week I'm talking about Zontar, the Thing from Venus, which is also known as Zontar, the Invader from Venus. This is a remake of Roger Corman's classic It Conquered the World, starring Peter Graves and Lee Van Cleef. Corman's film was still probably making lots of rounds either on TV or at drive-ins across the country, but it proved popular enough to get a made-for-TV remake only 11 years later. Now, if Roger Corman is kind of the king of the drive-in B-movie, then Zontar's director Larry Buchanan was the king of the low-grade Z-movie. Buchanan made a career out of remaking low-budget films from American International Pictures. That was the distributor on several of the 50s and 60s Corman films. Now, what's funny is that it was AIP themselves remaking their own barely decade-old films. Yeah, Corman had moved on to producing his own films and was starting to make movies for major studios like Columbia before the end of the 60s, but AIP had the rights to their own, at least somewhat popular films, which included a lot of Corman's old hits. Buchanan was given one directive from AIP, and that was, we want cheap color pictures, we want half-assed names in them, and we want them 80 minutes long. Most importantly, we want them now. So with that, Buchanan started cranking out some movies. Most of his well-liked movies were a run of 8 movies that he made between 1967 and 1969 that were made for TV through AIP's television arm. Zontar is one of these, but a handful of those 8 movies were Corman films that Buchanan was remaking. During this time, there were things that Buchanan would be pretty well known for, like monsters with eyes made out of ping pong balls, a ton of day-for-night shooting where you would shoot in low light or shaded areas or put a gel over the camera or something like that during the day to basically simulate night. Super low production values, of course, and at least one reasonably recognizable actor in the lead. And in this movie's case, that well-known lead actor is John Agar, who had been a star with Universal in the 50s. And if you want to know a little bit more about Buchanan, I recommend you go to my website, B-Movie Enema, and go there in a few weeks and watch the episode of B-Movie Enema, the series, on Mistress of the Apes. Now, one thing that I don't talk too much about in that Mistress of the Apes episode are the early days of Buchanan and how he got into film. He was born in 1923 and was raised in an orphanage in Dallas, Texas. And he said that he fell in love with the movies while watching the movies that played in the little movie room that was set up for the orphans. He eventually would go off to Hollywood, and he got a job at 20th Century Fox. He'd get bit parts and work odd jobs on the studio lot, and he ended up enlisting in the Army's Signal Corps, as that would give him a chance to basically learn how to direct. And since he was based in New York, he could also do his Army stuff during the day and then act on stage in the evenings. In the early 50s, he started making his own shorts, but his first feature film was called Grubstake. Now, get this Schlockmeister had some pretty powerful friends. He knew Stanley Kubrick from his time in New York. Kubrick basically offered to be his cinematographer, but Buchanan couldn't afford him. That's pretty nuts. And what makes that fact so odd is that Buchanan is every bit the self-proclaimed Schlockmeister, as I just called him. He knows he made bad movies. However, he did something that few filmmakers this side of Roger Corman can claim. All of his movies either broke even or made a profit. That's wild because most of his movies are just terrible. If you check out that episode of B-Movie Enema, the series, you'll see me struggle through Mistress of the Apes. But hey, it at least broke even. Corman, while also employing several cost-effective measures that Buchanan did, made movies that still had a charm to them that Buchanan's films just don't have. I guess it's just a certain level of je ne sais quoi in Corman's art, I guess. And I think when people pick on Corman movies, I think they're really thinking Corman made the movies that Buchanan made, and not more easygoing drive-in flicks he made that were stupid in many cases, but not trash. And like I said, kind of had that charm. Charm's going to be a big thing coming up here in a little bit in this episode, so stay tuned here. Now, Zontar opens with a group of scientists, apparently from NASA or something, preparing for a launch of a laser satellite. Dr. Ritchie is a NASA scientist, and he's arguing with a colleague, Dr. Taylor, who's played by Agar, about the launch. Now, he thinks that the cosmos and the beings out there are kind of wanting to make sure Earth does not communicate with anyone off-world because, as he puts it, humanity is just not ready to join the galactic neighborhood of intelligent socialites. But sometime later, Dr. Ritchie, despite his wife's pleas, reveals that he's been in communication with a Venusian creature named Zontar. Now, Dr. Taylor can't hear something under the static from Venus that Ritchie is playing for him and saying is some sort of subspace hypnotism that he can hear and understand. He says this Zontar is about to make his move to come to Earth. And it's just about then that Taylor finds out that the laser satellite he launched a couple of months ago has suddenly disappeared and out of communication range. Oddly, the satellite suddenly reappears and is working properly. Taylor decides to bring the satellite down for some diagnostic work. The reason it went off the grid? Well, Zontar brought the satellite to Venus, got on board, and returned it to Earth's orbit all within an hour. Zontar lands the satellite in a cave without detection, and Dr. Ritchie is quite excited about this, but his wife Martha is really worried her husband has kind of lost his mind. Soon, anything that uses power is blocked. Not only is the power down, but cars suddenly stop on the road. Even welders' arc torches aren't working. They even say that the water system has been shut down too. Now, while the town deals with the power issues and all of the weird stuff going on, Ritchie talks to Zontar and tells him the name of important people in town, like the police chief, the mayor, the general of the nearby army base where the experiments are happening, and Dr. Taylor. Along with their wives, Zontar should be able to control the town pretty quickly with those 8 people. We then learn that Zontar is going to send out these flying, what they're called injectopods, that look a little bit like a flying lobster. Dr. Taylor and his wife Anne, walking from where their car had shut down out of town, see one of the flying creatures, but he's able to throw a stick at it to ward it off. Ritchie tells Taylor about Zontar and his little plan while one of the flying lobsters stings the army general. Ritchie says that he's not fighting against Zontar because he's working with him. He believes that Zontar is there to save them from themselves by changing people's way of thinking to a more orderly, logical fashion. Zontar uses the general to take the town over with martial law and to essentially clear out the base. He also keeps the satellite scientists in protective custody at their lab. While the town is panicking over the martial law and the lack of power and everything, all the other weird stuff going on, Zontar's flying lobsters gets the sheriff. The sheriff then in turn kills the publisher of the newspaper, which Dr. Taylor actually witnesses. It's then when Taylor learns that he's to also become part of Zontar. Ritchie tells Martha about how Zontar controls people through removing their emotions, and Martha thinks this essentially kills the human host. Ritchie thinks that this is the only way for humanity to be saved from itself. And Taylor goes back to Ritchie after seeing evidence that everything about Zontar is true, and Taylor swears he will not join Zontar, especially after Ritchie explains how tightly he's connected to this whole invasion. Martha explains that Dr. Taylor was being the best friend he's ever had, or else he would have killed Richie as surely as he will find a way to kill Zontar. Unfortunately for Dr. Taylor, while all of this is going on, his wife Anne was taken control of by one of Zontar's injectopods. She throws one of the injectopods at Taylor and says that she's going to go for a walk, and when she gets back, he'll probably feel a whole lot better about everything. Taylor kills the injectopod, which means that what he learns from a call that he gets immediately after that from Richie, that Zontar is going to need several hours until he can grow a new injectopod to send out for Dr. Taylor. Martha learns that Richie has been given an order to kill Taylor when he invites him over. And Anne comes home and tells Taylor that they have to wait for the next orders from Zontar for the conquest of the world. Realizing that there's no way to get her back to the way she was, Taylor kills Anne. Now, I don't remember if I brought this up with It Conquered the World, but I really don't understand why our hero has to kill his wife. I feel like he should find out first if killing Zontar will free the people under his control, but I don't know. He just flat out kills his wife. At least in the original, I feel like Peter Graves had to kind of defend himself from his wife after he killed the bat thing that controls people for the invader. It just kind of feels like John Agar was just jumping right to wife murder. Now, while Taylor confronts Richie one last time, this time with a gun, with the hope that he can convince Richie that Zontar has no emotions, he essentially reasons, concludes, and then destroys. Martha decides to go to the cave that Zontar is in that she learned about from her husband. And she's also got a gun to kill Zontar, but when she sees the Venusian creature, she screams, and it's heard on Richie's radio that he uses to communicate with Zontar. She tries shooting the creature, but it has no effect. Zontar ends up killing Martha while Richie and Taylor overhear that on the radio. This finally makes Richie realize that Zontar is indeed a bad guy, and he needs to help Taylor destroy the invader. While Taylor goes and deals with the people who've been taken over by the injectopods, Richie goes to the cave with this laser that he's been experimenting on. It does kill Zontar, but he has to sacrifice himself as well. Taylor is left to ponder what it was that Richie must have learned in his last few minutes of life about how humanity can become better by looking within instead of without for the answers to all of their problems. So let's get to my 3 things I like about Zontar, the Thing from Venus. Admittedly, this is going to be a hard thing to do. There's just something about this movie that feels off. It's not terrible, but it feels cheap as hell. I knew this one would be probably the toughest movie to talk about this month, and it did not disappoint. I think the first thing I have to say is that I actually kind of liked that there's, at times at least, seems like there really was an attempt to make it look like Roger Corman's It Conquered the World. The Ritchie's house, for example, looks a little bit like the house that the Andersons, which were played by Lee Van Cleef and Beverly Garland in the original, lived in. Maybe it's a Mandela effect thing, I don't know. It just looks recognizable, and it just feels like it wants to be that other movie while being kind of a cheap knockoff. However, my second like makes it clear that it does not want to be the original. There's such a clinical feel to this movie. Cameras are positioned in a fairly static way that don't hardly move. There are just a couple of instances in which a camera moves to follow people walking, but it's really rare. The way the movie looks, the way the actors speak their lines, it feels more like an industrial film. It might be the TV cameras or those static shots. Either way, I'm not sure. There was a thing that happens when Zontar, or whatever the cucumber-like creature was in the original was called, takes control of a person. And it was kind of like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where people would just get a little emotionless. They said things in funny ways and seemed just less than human. That's exactly what this movie is like. It's like this movie was taken over by Zontar and just doesn't have any emotion to it. Or whatever emotions it does have, it's weird and inhuman. It's not without charm, but it also feels like it has negative charm. Like it's so charmless, it's charming. Now, thirdly, I kind of like the updated appearance of the creature. Zontar is like, it almost looks like it has 3 eyes. I don't think it does, but it looks like a slimy bat or pterodactyl-like monster. He's kind of like Rodan if Rodan was stuck in a microwave for about 30 seconds on high. It's a gross looking thing too. The original movie's creature is something of a living cucumber thing, and this actually looks like a ghastly alien that is actually kind of scary. Again, there's a charm to the living cucumber thing, and the slimy gross Rodan thing has like negative charm, but again, it has that in that charming way. And just to kind of wrap things up here, I have to say this movie really isn't very good. It's stiff and kind of soulless, but something that was easy to sell to TV stations probably pretty cheap. It's the kind of bad, though, that is kind of inoffensive to the senses. All the movies I've watched, it's far from the worst monster movie I've ever seen. It's definitely not the worst movie I've seen for this show. In fact, there is one big budget movie I covered early on in the existence of the show that I would rather not watch again while giving Zontar another go. But buyer beware that this isn't one of those quote-unquote so bad it's good type of movies either. It's just kind of is. It just kind of is. That's the best way I can say that. And that's, also sometimes all a monster movie needs to be. Now that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, and Spotify. You can hop on over to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and follow Film Seizure by just searching for Film Seizure. Hey, and while you're at it, head over to my website, bmovieenema.com, and read new text articles each and every Friday. You can also follow B-Movie Enema on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that, B-Movie Enema. And hey, you can go over to YouTube and you can subscribe not only to Film Seizure, where we upload everything there, but also B-Movie Enema has a channel where you can find those episodes of that B-Movie Enema, the series show that I was talking about earlier. And you can also see a bunch of clips that I grab and use for my articles. Now, in just a couple of weeks or so, I am going to be giving an announcement about the future of Monster Mondays. I don't want you to miss that. So come back and keep listening here. And until next week, stay spooky.